recording. Hello, welcome back. Or if you missed last week, welcome. Nice to see you all. Hello, Garden Flat. Right, I'm just letting people in and then we'll get started. 25 so far. Okay, well, we'll get started. Today we're joined by John Dixon, who's just been telling me about his career. So he was the curator of reptiles and amphibians at Bristol Zoo for a long time, you said, John, is that right?
10 years.
10 years. He's a lecturer at City of Bristol in ecology, but his main passion, and the reason he's here tonight, is that he's the chairman of the Reptile and Amphibian Group of Somerset. So he's got a lot of experience and expertise in a lot of areas of ecology, but his passion is ponds and water. So he's going to tell us today all about ponds. John really wants you to ask questions and this to be interactive and informal. So if you want to ask a question, just interrupt John, he's okay with that. If you don't feel like you want to ask a question with your voice, you can just type it in the chat and I'll ask it for you. And we'll have time at the end for lots of questions as well. So yeah, I think that's everything. It's being recorded, so if you don't want to be on the video, turn your video off. And we'll have a break halfway through as well. Okay, over to you, John.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephanie. I hope everybody can see my screen. I've gone off-piste a little bit from Stephanie's brief for tonight because she asked me to talk specifically about some various things which I seem to have disappeared off the course a bit from. What I've got basically is a session on how to create ponds in your garden, which I hope will be useful for some people. Yes. I'm here as a bit of a, well, I don't know, I don't claim to be an expert in ponds, but I am quite enthusiastic about ponds, and my enthusiasm comes primarily from amphibians, which I'm interested in. And the reason that I think I've been asked here tonight really is because as the chairman of the Reptile and Amphibian Group for Somerset, we've been involved in a project to restore old ponds up on the Mendip Hills, specifically for great crested newts. And we've been doing that for quite a number of years now, and so that's given us quite a lot of expertise, or not expertise, a lot of experience rather, in ponds and different types of ponds and one thing and another. So hopefully I should be able to help people who are interested in ponds. I'm going to start just by considering what a pond is. There are so many different types of ponds that it can get a little bit bewildering, but essentially they're any sort of water body that's between a square meter and 2 hectares in area, that holds water, not necessarily permanently, but holds water for at least a part of the year. Anything above 2 hectares would be considered a lake, and they have a slightly different ecology than ponds do. Most ponds are man-made. It's very difficult to identify ponds that are what you might describe as natural. At one time, there would have been a lot of ponds that were being created, or there would have been a lot of ponds around that had been created by natural processes. So things like geological movements, changes in river courses and one thing and another would have produced ponds. But nowadays it's really, really difficult to identify those that are truly natural. And I think very few of them are. Most of them are, even in the wider landscape, are excavations that have been created by humans at some point and just happen to have filled up with water. There are still some, Norfolk is particularly well known for natural ponds, mostly sort of glacial ponds and things like that. But there's very few, I think. Most of them are man-made, and in fact, most of them are lined in some way. So we can think of ponds in different sort of ways. There's on the left there, you can see what I would describe as a natural pond, or at least an unlined pond, given that we don't know really what the origins of them are, but it's not one that's lined in any way. The middle one there is what might be typical of a fish pond for koi keepers or something like that. And the one on the left, the one on the right, I beg your pardon, is what I would describe as a sort of garden wildlife. And these are the ones that I'm really going to be talking about tonight. I think these are within the grasp of most people to create if they've got a garden of some sort. So it's really wildlife ponds that I'm talking about. I'm not going to be talking about fish ponds, except perhaps in a comparative way in some aspects of what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm really not talking about much about the wider landscape pond. So that's what a pond is. What is the value of ponds? Why are ponds important? Well, in my view, they're really important. In Britain, there's only one habitat that is more biodiverse, that contains more species of plants and animals, and that's the sea. So with the exception of the sea, ponds are the most biodiverse habitat in the UK. We all get very excited about, I don't know, ancient woodlands and things like that, but in comparison to ponds, they have relatively small biodiversity. So ponds are really important. To give you some sort of statistics, some sort of idea of just how many species you will find in ponds, there was a national survey in 1998 that recorded over 400 species of plants and just under 400 species of macroinvertebrates. Macroinvertebrates are large ones, water beetles and things like that. This doesn't include all of the microinvertebrates that live in ponds, which would probably outnumber the macro ones by some way. So you can see immediately that you've got something like 800 species, just the plants and the macroinvertebrates. It doesn't include the amphibians, it doesn't include microinvertebrates or anything else like that. So huge number of species are dependent on ponds. In Britain, we have something called the Red Data Book. The Red Data Book is a list of species that are declining. The species that are declining are said to be Red Data Book species. There's 150 invertebrate species listed as Red Data Book species, so those that are vulnerable to extinction or are in decline. 150 of those are only found in ponds. And then another little statistic, in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, Schedules 5 and 8 are the schedules that protect species, give them legal protection. And 38 freshwater organisms are listed on these schedules. So 38 freshwater organisms have legal protection in this country. And of them, 23 of them, or 60% of them, are found in ponds. So there's quite a lot of rare species that are dependent on ponds. So they are valuable habitats. So why create one? Well, first of all, because we've seen that they're quite important for quite a lot of species, but they're also disappearing. They have a history, quite a long history now. Over the last 150 years or so, ponds have been declining in Britain. I'm talking now about wider landscape ponds. Garden ponds are a much more recent addition, but some of you may be familiar with this guy, Oliver Rackham. He's what you might describe as a sort of landscape historian, I suppose. And he writes quite a lot about how the landscape in Britain has been shaped by man, really. And he did an analysis of maps going back to 1880. And he estimated that in 1880, there was about 800,000 ponds in England and Wales. He didn't include Scotland in his analysis. There was a similar survey in the 1920s, so only 40 years later, which estimated that was only about 340,000 ponds. So already there was a big decline at the turn of the sort of the 20th century, I beg your pardon. And then much later in 1996, the Freshwater Habitats Trust did a lowland pond survey. Only lowland ponds. It didn't include upland ponds, sort of ponds in mountains and tarns and things like that. And they estimated that in the mid 1990s there was just shy of 230,000 ponds left in the countryside. So it's been a really sharp decrease in the number of ponds. And as the ponds have been lost, so too have the animals that have and the plants that are dependent on them. So this is why there's so many species that are reliant on ponds that are red data book species that are declining or threatened or vulnerable. Now, that's quite an incentive to create ponds. Why have they declined so fast? Why have ponds disappeared? Well, the main reason is agricultural improvements, if you like, because at the time of enclosure, when the landscape was being enclosed, every enclosure that was created for livestock would have had to have some way of watering the livestock. And in most cases, that was putting a pond in. So there would have been a proliferation of ponds in the sort of late 18th and early 19th century. And then in the mid 20th century, farmers moved away from ponds as a source of water for livestock, and instead they started installing water troughs that were fed from the mains water, and suddenly ponds became obsolete. And farmers much prefer if livestock are drinking from a pond, drinking clean water from the mains, because they don't get the disease and the parasites that they are likely to get from livestock drinking from ponds. Particularly liver fluke is quite prevalent in pond water. So the ponds became obsolete and a lot of them got filled in. And those that didn't get filled in really just got neglected. And ponds are transient anyway, so if they're not maintained, if they're neglected, they fill up with silt and eventually they revert back to dry land. So that's what's happened to a lot of the ponds in Britain. So quite an incentive to create ponds. Garden ponds are different than the ones I've just been talking about. The ones I've just been talking about are what you might describe as wider landscape ponds or farm ponds, really. Garden ponds didn't become popular until much later. Around about the 1960s, it became very fashionable to have ponds in gardens. And this was a bit of a blessing for a lot of the wildlife that are dependent on ponds, because it was a time, it coincided with a time when the wider landscape ponds were declining very rapidly. It was about the 1950s that farmers started installing mains water supplies into field troughs. And so around about the same time, comparable time, it suddenly became quite fashionable to put ponds in gardens. So a lot of the wildlife that were dependent on the ponds that were being lost in the wider landscape were able to substitute them with the increasing number of garden ponds. But not everything was able to do that. Garden ponds have shortcomings. One of the main ones was that most of the garden ponds that were put in the middle of the 20th century were put in for ornamental fish. And wildlife ponds and fishes don't really mix. Fishes have a lot of effects on ponds. They change the ecology of the ponds in all sorts of ways, which often don't suit a lot of the vulnerable wildlife. But some of the wildlife that is a bit more flexible is able to live alongside fishes. So those species that were the ones that had some cushioning against the loss of ponds. So we still have a lot of frogs, we still have a lot of smooth newts and palmate newts, because these things are able to live alongside fishes. But we have very few great crested newts, for example, because they're not able to live alongside fishes. So we see some animals benefiting from garden ponds and others less so. But of course you can create garden ponds as wildlife ponds and not simply as fish ponds. And that's what I'm going to try and encourage people to do tonight. So what sort of wildlife might you expect in a pond if you had put one in your garden? Well,
John, sorry to interrupt you. Your video for some reason is flashing.
I can see that. Why is it doing that? Do you know?
No, could you just turn it on and off again, do you think? See if that helps. On and off, that's the only technique I know.
That's better. Yeah,
You're
I'll
back.
I'll do it again if it starts doing that again.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, here we go. It's doing it again, isn't it?
It's doing it again. What the hell?
Let's just try that. Right, let's see how long that lasts. Oh, not long. I can't seem to do much about that by the looks of it. So what wildlife is a pond likely to attract? Well, it depends a lot on the pond, and there are all sorts of different types of ponds. So the size of the pond is going to make some sort of a difference. So even the smallest of ponds can attract an awful lot of species. But ponds can be permanent ponds. They can be semi-permanent ponds, so they can be seasonal ponds. We have a lot of ponds that dry out in the summer and are only sort of full of water during the winter and the spring and then perhaps the autumn. Ponds can be shaded. Ponds can be out in the open and catching a lot of sunlight. And ponds can be at different stages of succession. What that means is that ponds are temporary structures anyway, or temporary habitats anyway. If you were to dig a hole and it was to fill up with water and create a pond, then over time, what's going to happen is that the pond is going to fill up every season or every year rather with leaf litter. All of the plants that are living in the pond are going to die back in the winter and they're going to rot back into the water. And gradually, the silt levels are going to build up in the bottom of the pond. As the silt level builds up, so the water level gets shallower, and eventually you get to a point where the water level is shallow enough that trees and things can root into it. And once the trees root into it, they're going to take out the remaining water, which is already quite shallow. And so over a period of time, and it depends on the size and the depth of the pond, and the sort of surrounding area as well. But over time, all ponds are going to revert back to dry land. And that process from beginning to end is known as succession. And so a pond goes through these different phases of succession. The early phases of succession, the ones that you get when the pond has first been created, are characterized by great algal blooms. The reason being that there aren't many of the plants that you might want to grow in the pond at that point because it's early in the pond's development and ponds take time to mature. And so there's a lot of nutrients in the pond, particularly nitrates and phosphates, that aren't being taken out by the plants that are growing in the pond because there simply aren't very many because the pond is so young. And what will happen is that algae take advantage of this. So the early stages of succession in a pond are characterized by great blooms of algae. Once the pond gets a little bit more mature, and I reckon a pond takes about 10 to 15 years to mature, but as it's going through that process and it gets a little bit more mature, what happens then is that the macrophytes, or the plants that we want as opposed to the algae, if you like, start to compete with the algae for the available nutrients. And the nutrients are coming, the nutrients that I've mentioned, particularly nitrates, are coming from decay in the pond. So as plants and things like that start to decay and leaf litter is decaying, it's releasing nutrients into the pond. And the plants are taking this up, or the algae are taking it up. So what's happening as the pond matures is that the plants you want and the algae are competing for the available nutrients. And as the macrophytes, or the plants you want perhaps, dominate, so the early stages of succession that were characterized by great algal blooms, they start to settle down. The algae blooms don't happen so often. And everything starts to stabilize. Then you get into the sort of mid-successionary stage of the pond's life, if you like, where everything's fairly stable. and not much changes over time. This is a good time for the wildlife in the pond, really. And then you get into the late stages of succession where the silt level has built up enormously, and that causes various changes in the pond, particularly in the water column, because there isn't much of a water column anymore. You're talking about a very shallow pond at this point. And this is the point where I was saying that trees and things might be able to get their roots into the pond. And eventually you get to the end of the pond's life, where there is no pond anymore. So those are the sort of stages of succession. And there's quite obvious changes, and also some much more subtle ones as well.
John, could you talk about the time frames associated with those stages?
Well, it depends entirely on the pond. It's very difficult to say because it depends on the size of the pond in the first place and the depth of the pond, but it also depends on the surrounding area. If you've got a pond in woodland where there's a lot of leaf litter falling into the pond each year, then it's going to have a shorter life than a pond that's out in the open, for example, where that's not happening. If you get a pond that has very big emergent plants in it, like, for example, reed mace or bulrush, they create a huge amount of leaf litter every autumn. If they're not in a pond, if a pond's got smaller plants in there, then that's going to make a difference as well. I'll kind of talk about this as we go along a little bit more. But the point I'm trying to make at the moment is how ponds differ. So we have permanent ponds, we have ponds that are seasonal, we have ponds that are at different stages of succession. And all of these different kinds of ponds have a different, if you like, a different suite of species that are adapted to living in them. So if you have a pond that's not permanent and it's only seasonal, it doesn't make it less important than one that is permanent and has water all of the time. All of these ponds at different stages are incredibly important because they all have species that are specialized and adapted to living in them. They all create a different habitat for a different bunch of animals, basically, and a different bunch of plants. So they're all important. We have a tendency to think that a very late successionary stage pond is no longer very important, but it is because there are other species that live there. And often we get asked by people who move into a new house or something like that, what are we going to do with this pond that we've inherited? Because it's at a late stage of succession. It hasn't been maintained for a very long time. And the obvious answer would be to dredge it. But actually, that's not the obvious answer. People are often surprised because often we say, well, why don't you think about digging another one rather than destroying this one by digging it out and taking it right back to an earlier stage of succession, because there will be animals living in that pond that are dependent on that stage of succession in the pond. So let's just have a look at some of the wildlife that a pond might attract. I'm just going to turn my video off and try again just momentarily because it's driving me nuts watching myself.
I was thinking, John, I think it's to be when you're sharing your screen. So I've got your slides. Should I share the slides and you just talk and you can tell me when you want to go to the next? Yeah, do that. We can give it a try, can't we?
Okay, shall I stop sharing?
Yeah. No share. Where were we up to?
Scroll down a little way. I think we're at wildlife of ponds. Yeah, and the next one. Ooh. Am I going to be able to move these on myself, Steph, or
no? Just tell me when you want to.
Sorry?
Just tell me when you want the next slide.
All right. Can I have the next one now?
Yeah. I've got the wrong version though. Hang on.
You've got the wrong version.
Can you see that, guys? Can you see a presenter view?
Sorry?
It's giving me the presenter view. You can see it okay.
If you go into slideshow, I think you can click on there to show the actual slide without the bits down the side and above.
Sorry, I've got all these like taskbars that you can't see that are like hiding.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Show task
Well, I'm
one.
happy to plug on with sharing it from my end if you want me to.
Okay, let's just carry on like this.
All right.
Sorry, guys.
Okay. So having described all of these different types of ponds, you won't be surprised to know that most people, when they create a pond, want to create what you might describe as a classic permanent pond. And I completely understand why people want to produce that. But it's only one type of pond. And so it can only support a sort of range of wildlife that are adapted for a classic permanent pond. It won't attract those species that like the different types of ponds. So the seasonal ponds and one thing and another. Can we move on a slide, Steph?
Has it done it?
No, it hasn't moved on.
Has it done it now?
No, it's not moving.
Right, hang on. Sorry, everyone. What can you see now? Amphibians?
I don't mind. Do you want me to plug on with doing it from this end? Ah, there you go. That moved on then. That's brilliant.
They look great. I want them in my pond.
I think you might have gone forward a bit far. Is the one before that which has invertebrates, or do we start with amphibians?
Yeah, that's what I was looking at.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, invertebrates.
That one?
I've got dragonflies and damselflies.
I can only see amphibians at the moment.
Oh, no. I wonder if your connection.
Okay. Is that the previous slide that you just put up?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So so invertebrates are by far the most predominant animals that you'll get in a pond, any pond really. There will be dozens or perhaps hundreds of species, depending on the pond, of invertebrates in there. There will be a lot of micro invertebrates, which are going to be pretty inconspicuous, really, and you won't probably even know they're there. But some of them are going to be very conspicuous. These are the sort of larger macro invertebrates, and I couldn't possibly describe all of them and tell you what you're going to get into a pond, because you'll be surprised yourself what you get. It depends what lives in the local area as to what you'll be able to attract into your garden pond. But some that you might expect to get are things like damselflies and dragonflies. You'll undoubtedly get water beetles. All of these things that can fly, all of the invertebrates that can fly, are normally quite early colonizers of a new pond. Water snails and things may take longer because obviously they're not very mobile. But you may well get aquatic spiders as well. So this one here is the underwater spider, but there's other ones that are attracted to ponds that aren't necessarily aquatic themselves, but live in the sort of the emergent plants around the pond, that sort of thing. How do these immobile things like snails get into a pond? Well, they're not the best colonizers, it has to be said. They can take some time to get to a pond. But normally the way that they disperse is that ponds tend to act as clusters. So you might get animals moving from one pond to another within a cluster. And so imagine that you get a heron or something like that that might visit one pond and pick up a piece of leaf wrapped around its toe or something, and there might be some snail eggs on that. And then it moves to another pond and carries that with it, and then it gets shaken off in the other pond. This is the sort of way that some of these more immobile species get to colonize new ponds. So as you can imagine, it can sometimes take a little while. Can we move on to the next slide? No, nothing's happened. Okay. Here's another bunch of invertebrates. So you've got water beetles. Obviously the adult water beetle here on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is the water beetle larva, and another spider there. This is the lark spider. These are the sort of things that you might reasonably expect to find in a garden pond. Raft spider less so, but the water beetles will be in everybody's pond. Can we move on? Amphibians, which are something quite close to my heart. These are the three, if you like, common species, the ones that they are the ones that you are most likely to see in garden ponds. So you've got the common frog on the left-hand side, which are, as this name suggests, pretty common and found in a lot of garden ponds. The newt at the top is a palmate newt, and the one below it is a smooth newt. These two species are regularly associated with garden ponds, and if you have a pond in your garden, there is a high likelihood of getting at least some of these species attracted to it. Can we move on, Steph? These ones have slightly more stringent requirements about which sort of a pond they'll live in, but if you have the right sort of pond, then you may well attract common toads and great crested newts. Great crested newts seem to have become a lot of people's target species, if you like, to attract, partly because they're extraordinary animals. They're wonderful things to have in a pond, but also because their requirements are different than the other species. And if you can get the pond right for great crested newts, then it follows that it's correct for a lot of other species as well. So they're quite a good sort of aspiration, I suppose, when you're creating ponds. Can we move on? Once you get the amphibian populations established, then you can expect to get all of the predators that will follow. So, for example, grass snakes, which are incorrectly named, they should be called swamp snakes or something like that, because they are semi-aquatic. And once you've got a good population of amphibians, then the grass snakes will appear because they feed almost exclusively on amphibians. And there's various things that you can put, features that you can put around the pond, which will help also to attract things like grass snakes. So, for example, female grass snakes lay their eggs in compost heaps. So if you create big compost heaps around the pond and that sort of thing, then it gives them places to reproduce. You may also get herons or kingfishers or things like that, depending on the type of pond that you've got. They'll come in to feed on the amphibians that you've got. You can see a heron eating a great crested newt in the photo there. Can we move on, Steph? And if you're really lucky, you'll get some mammals as well. So here we've got a water vole. You probably need quite a large pond to attract water voles, but they can turn up in ponds from time to time. It's highly likely that you'll get bats. Bats are not obviously aquatic themselves, but they do drink from ponds. And one species, particularly one species, is known as a sort of pond bat, really, because they have a very close association with ponds. Where you have ponds on warm summer nights, you'll get great clouds of gnats and mosquitoes and things above the water surface. These are rather nicely known as ghosts of gnats, these great buzzing clouds of them. And bats will feed on those, and these things often gather over water. I don't know whether the little video is going to work. You want to give it a go, Steph, but it may not. No.
Sorry, I was muted. No, I don't think that's going to work. I can't see
No.
it. Just a little.
Okay, don't worry. Don't you love it when the technology works?
I don't know if now's a good time to interrupt you. We've had a few questions collecting in the chat.
Righto. I'll just explain what the video was going to show, and then.
Oh yeah. Oh no, he's gone. He's gone. No. He'll be back. Are there any particular plants that attract the bees? I know John's going to talk about plants soon, aquatic plants, so get ready for that. Cat patrolling, nightmare. Yeah, I think bats will use small ponds, but we need to wait for John, really. I'm not an expert on this.
I have a thought. I've got a thought on cats and frogs. I've got a little pond, really small pond in Easton, and so many cats, and I still get plenty of frogs actually. But it did take me ages. I think it took me about 4 years or something before the first frogs appeared, and then the first year or so first couple of years, like they laid frog spawn, and then it didn't hatch for some reason. But now I've got tons of frogs. I had to like clear my pond because I had a leak, and I found 17 frogs in there. And so yeah, even with loads of marauding cats around, they still were okay. So I don't know, just from my experience, I don't think cats put them off that much.
Oh, okay, thank you, Lucy. Yeah, it sounds like it's a waiting game. John said it takes 15 years for a pond to mature. So you've got to be in it for the long game with the old pond by the sounds of it. Okay, yeah. Hopefully he'll be back soon and we can ask him all these questions.
It's a definite investment in the future, isn't it, a pond?
It's the what? Oh, an investment in the future, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I've just made one on my allotment, and it's not full up yet, but I'm so excited. I'm just begging for it to rain.
Oh well, it will surely.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I might mistake that water bowl for a rat, to be quite honest.
I know. You're probably more, if you do see something that looks like that, it is probably a rat because they're quite,
yeah.
They're really, the water bowl. I've never seen one.
It's quite cute.
It is cute though.
I saw some, if anyone lives near Lawrence Western Moor, there's loads of water voles there. If you go out there, you might see one. And I did do a bit of training on like how to know if you've got them or not. So like you can look for little patches of they like garden little areas, and they sort of eat the reeds, and they bite them off in like a diagonal way. So if there's like reeds that have got a diagonal cut on them and they've been cut short in that way, then that's probably a water vole. And they also have like lots and lots of little runs, and then they have latrines. They're very clean. They kind of just poo in piles, unlike a rat which just poos wherever it wants. So that might be another way of telling if you've got them or not.
Nice. It looks like John's back. Are you there, John? Can you hear us? You're muted. Yay, John's back.
Right, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what happened there. Did that just happen for me, or did it happen for everybody?
Just you, sadly. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah. All right. Okay.
I don't know if your connection's a bit iffy.
Did you have some questions for me?
Yes, lots of questions. Okay, are you ready?
Yeah.
Are there particular plants that attract the beast? By the beast, did you mean the snake? No.
I think it was just any of them, you know. If we're looking for invertebrates and amphibians, is it just have a pond, or are there particular things that are good to plant or cultivate or whatever in the pond?
There certainly are, and I'll come to this later. But okay. Really, the key thing is that newts and frogs and toads, they all spawn rather differently. So frogs and toads have this sort of explosive single event where they produce this great big load of spawn.
Yeah.
Whereas newts tend to lay their eggs individually. And they lay each egg individually, and they use their back legs to wrap the egg up under a leaf and sort of make it into a little, fold the leaf over the egg and stick it down into a little package. So it's quite important for newts that they have plants that are the right shape, the leaves are the right shape and are flexible enough that they can fold them up to protect the egg. So there are plants that they prefer for doing this. And we'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about plants in a bit more detail later on anyway, so we can come back to that.
Thanks.
We've sort of talked about this one already while you were gone, but I have a tiny pond. I've had it for 3 years now. No sign of frogs. Our neighbouring cat patrols our garden. Would she deter frogs?
Are frogs attracted to the garden, did you say?
No, no frogs, but there's a cat, and Jan's wondering if the cat is deterring the frogs. Well,
it may be. It may well be. It may also be that there simply aren't any frogs in the local area. Sometimes you're only going to be able to attract what already lives in the area. And if there are no local frogs, then there's not going to be frogs attracted to the pond. They're going to have to come too far to reach it. But cats and amphibians don't really mix, and yeah, they're not really very good for frogs, cats. So it may be that the cat may, if it's not a deterrent, it may be that the local cats have finished off all the frogs.
Is it true that frogs and newts don't tend to be in the same pond?
Not entirely. It is true that frogs and great crested newts tend not to be in the same pond, because great crested newts are voracious predators of frogs, tadpoles and spawn, and they tend to eat pretty much all of the spawn and all of the tadpoles. The other smaller species of newts, the smooth newts and the palmate newts, will eat frog spawn, and they will eat the tadpoles when they're very, very tiny. But they don't have the appetites of a great crested newt because they're smaller species anyway. And the frogs, the tadpoles outgrow predation by those smaller species of newts fairly quickly. So you do find that they coexist, frogs and the smaller species of newts, but you don't tend to get frogs coexisting with great crested newts.
Thank you. This is from Jess. My neighbour brought round their resident toads to live in our micro pond. They were hibernating in our leaf mulch pile, but I haven't seen them recently. Is our pond likely too small, or could they still be hibernating?
No, they won't be hibernating now. The toads come out really early. Toads generally start emerging from hibernation by late February. And toads now have finished spawning. They have a very short breeding season. They're in the water for a very short amount of time, and they have been out of the water now for quite some weeks. So if they were going to spawn in her pond, they would have done by now. I would suggest perhaps the pond isn't suitable for toads. Toads are one of those species, a bit like the great crested newt, that have quite sort of stringent requirements for what sort of a profile of pond they will live in. And they generally like quite large ponds, and they like quite deep ponds. And toads are a species that will mix with fishes quite well, because the tadpole, well, in fact, every stage in the life cycle, the tadpole is spawned a lot, all have toxins, which fish find distasteful. So toads will live alongside fish, and so quite often you get them in the larger things like fishing lakes and things like that often make for good toad ponds. Garden ponds, less so, unless they're particularly large, sort of suburban or rural ones generally.
Oh no, sorry Jess, that's probably not the answer you wanted with your micro pond. Mo Shepherd asked, how would you know if you had water voles? Ooh.
You would need to have quite a large pond generally to have water voles, but they make quite characteristic burrows in the side of the pond. If you had a lined pond, then you're unlikely to have water voles because they're not going to be able to burrow into the sides. If you've got an unlined pond, that's when you're most likely to get water voles. But to get water voles in a garden pond is unusual. It's not impossible, but it's unusual. And again, it's probably likely that it's going to be in fairly large suburban or rural sort of gardens rather than in urban ones.
How big a surface area and how deep should we aim for a pond to be if we want it to be permanent? Are we going to go into this in more detail, John, aren't we, about building a
I
pond?
think we are, yeah. Should we carry on and come back to some questions later on?
Yeah, let's go.
Or do you want to take a break?
Do people need a break, do you think? A 5-minute toilet break?
Yeah, no.
No. Oh,
No,
people are
everybody's shaking their heads. Okay.
very adamant that they don't. Okay.
Let's crack on then.
Okay.
Do you want me to try and take control of the sharing of the thing again, or are you happy to do it from your end? Screen
Yeah,
sharing?
you do it, because it might add like a delay, didn't it, for you being able to see it?
Yeah,
So
let me see if it works then.
maybe we'll have a little play around if we ever do have a break, but I don't know.
Right, where have we got to? Okay, so that's sort of covered the wildlife that you're likely to get or you may get in a pond. But bear in mind that it depends on the type of pond as to what type of wildlife you might attract. So if you're thinking of putting a pond in, the next thing to think about really is where you're going to put it. My advice would be to give a pond as much sunlight as you can. It's going to be much better for the plant life, and the plant life is completely how much plant life you have will affect the quality of the water and all sorts of things. It's going to be one of the major underlying factors that determines what type of a pond you're going to have. So give it plenty of sunlight. Put a pond in a place where it's going to get pretty much full sun for most of the day. A lot of people are worried about doing that because they think it's going to encourage a lot of algal growth. And in the early stages of succession, it may, but it doesn't matter. Just think about what's going to happen later when you get all of the pond established and all of the plants established. And that's when being in full sunlight is going to really come into its own. One of the things to avoid is overhanging trees. If you get a lot of leaf litter falling into a pond, on the one hand, it's going to cause the silt to build up much quicker than otherwise. But the other thing, and perhaps more importantly, is that it's going to all break down and rot in the pond, and that's going to produce nitrates. And nitrates are the nutrients that we want to try and reduce in the pond. If we get a pond with excess nutrients, then the algae are going to take advantage of that. And so you're going to get big algal blooms, which you want to avoid. Another thing to think about if you're putting a pond in is how deep the water table is in your garden. We'll look at the options for lining a pond in a little while, but if you have the right sort of soil conditions that you don't need to line a pond, then it's going to be quite beneficial, in which case you dig down to the water table and you have an instant pond. So you might want to think about how deep the water table is. And the other thing you might want to think about is where your water supply is going to come from. Most ponds will just be perfectly all right filling from the rain, but you may, at least in the early stages, need some sort of water supply, because it may be that you need to line the pond and the liner needs to be held in position by the water pressure. So you're going to have to fill the pond instantly. So you want to be close enough to a water supply that you can do that. So those are the sort of key things to think about when deciding where to site a pond in your garden. And the next question is whether you need planning permission. If you're just putting a small pond into your garden, then the answer is no. Generally, as a rule of thumb, if you're digging a pond by hand, then you don't need planning permission. If you're having to get some sort of machinery in to dig the pond, then normally that would be considered an engineering operation, and that would require planning permission. There are exceptions to that engineering operation thing. For example, if it can be passed off as agricultural work, then that would be exempt from planning permission. But I would speak to a planning officer if you're planning anything more substantial than just a simple garden pond. Then I would talk to a planning officer and just ask whether you need planning permission or not. To be honest, I've never met anybody who's applied for planning permission for a pond. And I've never known anybody who's been made to fill in a pond because they haven't applied for planning permission. So I don't think it's a huge issue, really. There is this thing about water courses, though. If you're going to dig a pond and it's within a certain distance of a water course, then this introduces a whole other layer of permissions. The Environment Agency is responsible for what they describe as main rivers, and your local internal drainage board are responsible for smaller water courses, so ravines and streams and things like that. And if you're going to dig a pond or develop anything actually, but it includes ponds, within, you can see there, 8 meters for a main river and 9 meters of the bank of a smaller water course, then you need additional permission to do so. So probably most garden ponds aren't going to need any planning permission, but if you're doing anything that's a little bit more substantial than a simple garden pond, it's probably worth at least investigating whether it's going to need it or not. Otherwise, you might end up like this poor fella here. This guy is the only person I've ever come across who was actually done for not getting planning permission for a pond. And he built this extraordinary pond that you can see here in the picture, and then went for retrospective planning permission because all of his neighbors complained. So he then went to get retrospective planning permission for a wildlife pond. And extraordinarily, nobody believed it was really a wildlife pond. Can't imagine why they thought that. But anyway, he didn't get planning permission. So poor old Ed Sheeran, I think, had to get rid of his so-say wildlife pond. But he's the only person I've ever heard of that has had a run-in with the planning officers over a pond. And it doesn't look much like a wildlife pond to me, I have to say. So, having decided where you're going to put your pond, decided whether you need planning permission, then the next thing really is to consider what sort of shape and profile you want the pond to be. The shape doesn't really matter. You can make it any shape you want it to be. You can make it square, you can make it round, you can make it kidney shaped. It really doesn't matter. And the wildlife don't give a damn what the shape of the pond is. What is much more important is the profile of the pond. There's a couple of things to bear in mind. The first one is that the pond needs to be deep enough that it's not going to freeze right down to the bottom. That doesn't really need a lot of depth. Our winters aren't that harsh, really, so it's pretty unlikely that the pond's going to freeze right down. But the key thing as well about the profile is to try and get as much different depths, as many different depths as you can, because there's various species that like various different depths. So if you've got a lot of little shallow parts at the edges of the pond, the shallower water, this is where you might get a lot of different species gathering at different times, particularly because it's where the water gets warmest in summer. So you get big shoals of tadpoles that will gather in the shallows to take advantage of that. There's various invertebrates that are very fond of these little sort of shallower bits in the edges of the pond. But as well as having them, you want to have some other deeper areas for those species that do like them. Now, this worked really well for me one time. I was describing the importance of the little shallow areas to somebody while I was talking to him about his pond. And one of the things I was describing was the importance of what you call the drawdown zone. Now, in summer, the water level is going to drop in a pond. And if you have a pond with essentially vertical sides, then if you, say, lose 2 inches of water, then on the vertical side, you're going to lose 2 inches of water. If you have a very, very gentle slope down into your pond, then a 2-inch drop of water could result in a very wide margin where the water has gone down, a sort of tidal margin, if you want to call it that, although it's obviously not tidal, it's seasonal. The wider that drawdown zone is, the better, because there's a lot of stuff that is very dependent on these drawdown zones. And why this worked so well for me was because I was explaining to a farmer one time the importance of these drawdown zones as we were walking out to go and have a look at his pond. And when we got to the pond, there was quite a wide drawdown zone, probably about 18 inches wide, I should think, because the water had dropped down. It was quite a warm period of the year. And this 18-inch sort of drawdown zone all around the pond was absolutely covered in flies. Little, I think they're called St. Mark's flies. They're little flies that were getting salts. They were landing on this drawdown zone and sucking salts out of the ground. And they weren't anywhere else. They weren't above the drawdown zone. They weren't on the water itself. So obviously it just illustrated what I was trying to say about the importance of this little margin around the pond. So having nice sloping sides gives you a good drawdown zone, which a lot of species will take advantage of. In the pond itself, the depth of the pond is important because it affects the oxygenation. You need to have oxygen right the way through the water column down to the bottom, because some things may, for example, hibernate in the mud in the bottom. So you need to have make sure that the water right the way through is oxygenated. And to gain maximum oxygenation or sufficient oxygenation in the water, the surface area has got to be about 5 times the maximum depth. So if you've got a maximum depth of 2 foot, then the surface area has got to be 5 times that. Okay, so make sure that you've got enough depth to get enough surface area to depth ratio to get oxygenation right the way through. The next question is going to be whether you want to filter the pond or not. What I'm talking about here are wildlife ponds, and there should be no necessity to filter a wildlife pond. If you're keeping fish, then that's different. But a wildlife pond will reach an equilibrium. All of the plant life is going to reach an equilibrium in the pond with the bacteria that live in there and everything else to maintain your water quality. Let me explain how it works. In every pond, you have 2 species of bacteria that are very important. One is called Nitrosomonas bacteria, and the other one is called Nitrobacter. And these appear spontaneously in any standing water very quickly. They're the 2 things that are responsible for maintaining the water quality, or part of the sort of cycle, if you like. They're an important part of the cycle for maintaining water quality. When something dies in a pond, a plant or an animal, or when any organic matter is breaking down and rotting in the pond, what it's going to produce initially is ammonia. And ammonia is a really toxic chemical. Anything living in the pond is not going to be able to survive any buildup or any great concentration of ammonia. Ammonia needs to be removed from the water as soon as possible. And the Nitrosomonas bacteria love ammonia. Nitrosomonas bacteria metabolize ammonia, and they gain their own energy from metabolizing ammonia. And the waste product that they produce from the metabolization of ammonia is another slightly different nitrogenous molecule called nitrite. And nitrite as well is quite a toxic chemical. You wouldn't want too much of it to build up in the water. Not as toxic as ammonia, but nevertheless not very nice for living organisms. So what will happen now to the nitrite is that the second bacteria I mentioned, Nitrobacter, in the same way, they can metabolize nitrite. And so they metabolize nitrite to gain their own energy from that. And the waste product of that chemical reaction is another nitrogenous or another nitrogenous I can't remember the word I'm looking for. Another nitrogenous chemical called nitrate. Okay, so you start with ammonia, that gets converted to nitrite, and nitrite gets converted to nitrate, and nitrate is plant food. So the nitrate won't build up in the water, and even if it does a little bit, it doesn't matter because it's not terribly toxic to animals and plants. But the plants will feed on it, and they'll take the nitrates out, and then of course the plants will die eventually, and so all of the growth that the nitrates have enabled will break down into the water and produce ammonia again. So it closes the cycle, and so you have this nitrogen cycle going on in the water all of the time, and this is what maintains the quality of the water. If that nitrogen cycle is working correctly, then the water will stay nice and clean, chemically clean, if you like. It may, there's two different things going on. One is the chemistry of the water, and one is the clarity of the water. The two aren't necessarily connected. The clarity of the water can be altered by all sorts of things. So you may get an algal bloom that might turn the water green, particularly in the spring. It doesn't matter. The clarity of the water isn't too important. The chemistry of the water is what's important. Green water can be very healthy. Likewise, you may get something that stirs all of the sediments up in the bottom, and so the water may go brown. It may look like Western Supermare for a little while, but that again doesn't matter. The chemistry won't necessarily have been upset, and the water, even if it's brown, can still be very healthy water. So don't worry too much about the clarity of the water. The chemistry is what's important. Once the pond's established and you've got this sort of nitrogen cycle working properly, then what will happen is that the pond will reach an equilibrium and it becomes an ecosystem in its own right. Everything that's in the pond is managing the quality of the water. That can be disturbed. Two things that frequently disturb water quality are, first of all, agricultural runoff. So if you're in a place where there's a lot of very fertile fields around, and your pond is downhill of them, and you get a really big downpour or torrential rain one night or one day, what you might find is that all of that fertility on the fields, if they've been spreading dung or something like that on the fields perhaps, will run off into your pond. And suddenly you get a bloom of algae because you've introduced a whole load more nutrients, a whole load more nitrates. And the plants that you've got in the pond, they can only grow proportionate to the amount of nitrates that there's normally in the pond. If you get a sudden influx of nitrates, then the plants won't be able to cope with it all, and you'll get an algal bloom because the algae will take advantage of it. So you can see, maintaining the pond, maintaining the equilibrium in the pond is really about trying to prevent too much nutrients building up in the pond. And that comes down, when we talk about maintenance, you'll see that the maintenance is largely about reducing the amount of nutrients in the pond. Fish can alter this equilibrium as well. If you had a wildlife pond that was ticking over nicely like this, and then you introduced fish, that would change everything, because the fishes produce an awful lot of waste. So suddenly you've increased the amount of nutrients going into the pond, okay? But also you're going to affect clarity as well, because the fishes are going to go around stirring up the substrate, the silt. So you're likely to lose the clarity of the pond. It won't be clear. But also the fishes are likely to eat the plants. And the plants, of course, are what are removing the nitrates from the pond. So the fishes are going to create more nutrients and also remove the plants that are removing the nutrients. So they're going to change the balance altogether. So fishes don't really work in a wildlife pond. But if you get a wildlife pond that is established and the equilibrium is established, you will not need to filter it. It's a complete ecosystem in its own right. So you've decided you want a pond, and you've gone through all of the hoops that I've just described, and the next thing is to dig the pond. Well, the timing doesn't really matter. That's going to be dictated by ground conditions rather than anything else. So perhaps in the middle of summer, when the ground's really hard, might not be a great time to start digging your pond. But and again, with the summers we get, sometimes it might be. Who knows? But the timing doesn't really matter. Just work on the ground conditions when it's easiest to dig. What does matter is the utilities. So you may find that you've got water mains or gas mains or electric mains or something like that under your garden. Make sure that you've been in touch with the service operators, because they should be able to provide the location of any sort of main structures underneath your garden. You don't want to dig through an electricity cable. That wouldn't do anyone a lot of good. And the other thing to think about is what you're going to do with the spoil. Digging a pond can produce an awful lot of spoil. If you can lose it in the garden to landscape something or something like that, it's going to be the best option, because it can be extremely expensive if you need to remove it from the site. So think about how you can re-landscape your garden to get rid of all of the spoil that's going to come out, create banks or something like that. It's also legally quite complicated to remove the spoil, because for reasons that I don't quite understand, it's normally considered to be toxic waste, even though it's just soil and stuff like that. And you may find that you need to get some sort of a licensed contractor in to remove it. You can't just take it and give it to your local farmer to spread on his fields. It's more complicated than that. So you need to think about what you're going to do with the spoil. Those are the main considerations with the digging of it. Once you started digging, one of the key things you're going to have to do is to find the levels. If you don't get this right, then what you can end up with is one side of the pond being higher than the other. It doesn't really matter as such. The water level will only go up to the top of the lower side, obviously. But if you're lining the pond, and we'll talk about lining in a moment, but supposing you're lining the pond with some sort of plastic liner, then you're going to have large areas of exposed plastic on one side of the pond, because the rim of the pond is higher on one side than the other. And that's just going to be unsightly. So you need to get the levels right. If the pond is small enough, the key way, or the easiest way rather, to do that is simply to lay a plank across from one side to the other and put a spirit level on the plank, like you can see in the picture here. If your pond is too large to get a plank across it like that, then what you can do is get a piece of hose pipe, a clear piece of hose pipe, so you can see the water inside it. Fill it with water, and then get two people, one on either end of the pond. The hose pipe has to obviously be long enough to stretch easily between the two, with the majority of the hose sitting on the bottom of the pond, so some excess hose. And if you have one person at either end holding the hose, the end of the hose up to the edge of the pond, then when the water level at either end of the hose is in the same position relative to the end of the hose, then you'll be getting the levels right. So a clear piece of hose held at either side of the pond, equalize the levels of the water in the hose at either end, and then you've got your levels right. If you can't get the levels right, if you're on a slope or something like that, then you may find that you have to build a bund or something on the downhill side to build that up a little bit. That's probably quite a good way to get rid of some of the spoil. But the levels are important. You want to get them right early on. Sorry, you're saying something, Steph?
What's a bund?
A bund, a bank. So you're just building up one side to get it up to the level of the other side. That would only be necessary if you're trying to build on a bit of a slope. Okay, so we thought we'd do a little poll here. First of all, what I'd like to know is how many people that are listening to this already have a pond in their garden. And of those people that do, we've got a bunch of options here for what it could be lined with. So I'm quite interested to know what liners people have got.
Can you see the results, John?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Okay, good.
So what I'm seeing, apparently 100% have answered. 73% of you have a pond already. And of those, people that have no liners at all is 19%. People that have molded fiberglass is 19%. And the vast majority of you have plastic or rubber liners. Nobody has concrete. Nobody has clay, which is quite interesting. And nobody has anything else. I wasn't really expecting another. I don't know what the other would be. But I'm quite interested that nobody's got clay. I'll explain why in a moment. Do I just press the click on the end of poll to get rid of it?
Yeah, I can see that 3 people chose other for some reason on mine.
You can see what?
3 people clicked other on mine in terms of what.
Yes, they did on mine. Sorry. Yep, they did. I can see that. For some reason, I didn't have it down, hadn't scrolled down far enough. I could see the other, but not the line underneath it. Oh, that's interesting. I might come back to those 3 and ask what other is in a bit.
Yeah.
But let me just have a look at what liners are available. Oh, hang on, can move on. For some reason now, my screen isn't moving on.
Okay, that's that resolved. People only clicked other because they had to click something, and the poll wouldn't let them move on till they clicked something, so they clicked other.
Okay.
So you're right. Nobody has got another one.
Nobody has got other, but for some reason, Steph, my screen isn't moving on now.
Oh dear. Do you want to stop sharing and click share again?
Yeah, let me do that.
Bye, Leslie. Is that working now?
No, it's frozen on that one.
Oh, flipping it. I'll share it then.
Yeah, okay.
We'll get there in the end. They've got 2 screens. It splits it over 2 screens and makes it really difficult. It's really annoying. Okay, bear with me, everyone.
That looks good. I can see that.
Good,
Scroll it down to the slide that about lining.
Here we go. Can you see that, John?
Yes, I can see it. Yeah. You're on the wildlife bit. Can you scroll down to the line a bit?
I think it'll catch up in a minute. Can you see it now?
I can't see the slide I'm after. I'm on the wildlife slide here.
Oh. Well, I can see I'm on the lining slide. So for some reason, there's yeah.
Oh, why is that then? Is everybody else on the liner slide?
Oh, I can only see the wildlife.
No, I'm on wildlife too. Amy, it might be worth you sharing and unsharing and then resharing on the right slide.
Okay.
Great, all of you. It's great. Always a nightmare, technology.
It is.
It is. Wonder why it's doing this to us. Share screen.
Ah, okay. Now I've got the liners.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Can you put it into into the slideshow mode?
That's the best I can do.
Is it? Okay, that's all right. Okay, so these are essentially the sort of options for lining. Once you've created your excavation, then you can have either molded fiberglass, which is something like the top left-hand corner there. These are quite popular, but I would avoid them if you can, for a number of reasons. The first one is that they're not very flexible, and they can split and crack quite easily. And you have to get the excavation exactly the right shape to put the molded fiberglass in. If you get it the wrong, if you don't quite get the excavation the right shape for the shape of the molded fiberglass that's going in, then what happens is you get air pockets or empty pockets underneath it. And these are going to be weak spots where the pressure of water are likely to crack it at some point during its life. So they don't often have quite the longevity that you might expect. But nevertheless, they're quite popular. So they're quite good for small gardens and things like that. Probably the most popular option are some form of flexible plastics or rubber, which is what I've shown as that sort of roll just underneath the molded fiberglass one, the one in the middle of the three on the right-hand side. I'll talk about these in more detail in a moment. The other options are bentonite, which some of you may have heard of. It's a very popular option at the moment. And again, I'll discuss all of these in more detail in a moment. The next option really is concrete. And the final option is puddling clay. If we can move on, I'll look at each one of those individually very quickly. Or actually, maybe not. Leave it there for a moment, Steph, that'd be fine. I'll talk about them now. The molded fiberglass I've kind of covered already. The flexible plastics and rubber, there's essentially three options of those. The first one is PVC, the second one is butyl, and the third is something called EPDM. Now, in terms of quality, I would say that butyl and EPDM are probably the better options than PVC. PVC is the cheaper option. And a PVC liner is the cheaper option because it's not the best quality, really. What happens is that it reacts to ultraviolet light, and that makes it very brittle. And it also reacts to temperatures, so freezing over winter and that sort of thing will also make PVC very brittle. So often it doesn't really cut the mustard, I would say, because it just doesn't have the longevity of the other two. Butyl and EPDM are really the ones that are going to be better. They don't react to ultraviolet. They don't react to freezing and to extreme temperatures. And mostly they have what they describe as a lifetime guarantee. I don't know quite what that means, but I think it's probably about 25 years. They're very flexible. They're not that difficult to lay, although they do need an underlay. So a piece of old carpet or perhaps sand to line the excavation, and then the butyl or the EPDM over the top of that. There's very little difference really between them. EPDM has more tensile strength than butyl does, although in the case of a pond liner, tensile strength isn't really a very important characteristic. But EPDM tends to be more expensive. They're both quite expensive. They're much more expensive than PVC, but you get what you pay for really with these. So these are the most popular options, I would say, at the moment. You can get them widely in garden centres or pond sort of shops or that sort of place. And they're the ones that I think are used most regularly. But there is a sort of school of thought that is increasing, which is that if you want to go to all the trouble of creating as natural a pond as possible, why would you dig an excavation and then fill it full of plastic? A lot of people see some sort of a conflict in that. And so what has become more popular of late is to use clays as liner. Now, you can do this in one of two ways, really. The first one is to puddle clay. That picture that you can see on the left-hand side at the bottom is people puddling clay. It looks like it's really labor intensive, and if you're doing it like that, it is, but it needn't be. Puddle clay as a liner for ponds is what's been used historically for forever, really. All of the sort of man-made wider landscape ponds that I described right at the beginning when I was saying that when the Enclosure Act was brought into force and all of the landscape was being enclosed, and every enclosure had to have some sort of a pond for watering livestock. A lot of these ponds were built from puddled clay. And what they did back in those days was they created the excavation, filled it with clay, which they would bring in from somewhere. And then they would either get people or animals, often the livestock, to puddle it, to just stamp it in. The idea is that what you're trying to do is you put the clay into the excavation, spread it out across the bottom of the excavation, and then the stamping or the puddling is about trying to squeeze all the air out of the clay, and that makes it impermeable. There's different kinds of clays, and not all clays have the same permeability. Some clays are much more permeable than others. So for puddling clay, you want to get the most impermeable clay that you can possibly lay your hands on. And the Environment Agency can help because they have a scale of permeability of different clays. So quite often, if you get in touch with them, they can help out with what sort of clays might be better for puddling. It needn't be labor intensive. You don't have to have a herd of sheep puddling it down, or yourself or your friends all coming round and puddling like this. What you can do these days is use machinery to do it. And so you have to buy in the clay. And once you've done that, then you can get a tractor with a bucket on the front, one of those front end loaders. That can be used to lift the clay and put it in the excavation. And then you can use the bucket or the front end loader to essentially spread the clay across the excavation and push it down and squeeze out all of the air from it. You're just trying to compress the clay. It has to be done in layers. So somebody who knows how to do this will do the first layer, compress it all down, spread it out, compress it down, and then put a second layer on top and do exactly the same thing again, and may even put a third layer on top again. So it can be done in an average sized pond. It can be done in a day. It's not a huge thing to do, but it's not worth doing it on a very, very small pond, but it would be worth doing it on a large pond. And it's permanent. It doesn't get punctured. And so it's really quite a nice way to do it. And people think that it's sort of an old skill that's been lost and all of that sort of stuff, but it's not. It can still be done. It's just that it's dropped out of fashion, I think, for a very long time, and people are rediscovering it. But there is another option with clay, which is a slightly easier one, which is that you can get a type of clay called bentonite. Bentonite clay is a very impermeable type of clay. It's a very good one for lining ponds. And you can buy it on a roll. And this picture that you can see bottom right is a section through a roll of bentonite. What they do with this clay is that they roll it into a flat sheet and desiccate it. And it's completely desiccated. And so it can be bought on a roll, the same as the flexible sort of plastics like butyl, but it's a much heavier roll, and it's a less flexible roll. And because it's so heavy, if you buy a roll of this and you want to lay it in your pond, what you would need to do is to probably have some sort of a tractor or something with a spike on the front that you can put the roll onto, because that's the only way you're going to get it onto site, because it is quite heavy. And once you've got the tractor sitting alongside the excavation, you can get some people to just pull the roll of bentonite clay off the front, just unroll it and lay it as you would a flexible plastic liner. When it gets wet, it expands, and it expands by 400, 500%. So if you've got it about 1/4 inch thick at the beginning, the desiccated roll, when you finish, you're going to have a 3-inch layer of clay, or maybe more. And it can't be punctured, because if you puncture it, it just self-seals. So if you wanted to line a pond with that, you could put a pontoon with legs, push it through the bottom of the roll of clay, and the clay would just seal up around the legs of the pontoon. So it's a really useful way of lining a pond. The only problem with it is, first of all, that you would need to make the excavation considerably larger or deeper than you would want the eventual pond to be, because you need to dump a load of soil on top of it. When it expands, if you don't have any weight of soil on top of it, it tends to expand and then sort of just break up. So it needs some pressure on top of it to expand into, if you like, or against. So you're probably going to want 6 inches to a foot of soil on top of this. So your excavation is going to have to be 6 inches or a foot deeper than you were planning to have the depth of your pond. But it's a good example. It's a good option. The other option is concrete. Concrete isn't great because it just breaks up. It's not flexible enough. Sorry, am I going over my time here?
Yeah, we've only got 3 minutes left.
Let's move on.
Yeah,
I'll go a bit quicker.
I don't think we can run over, so it'd be good to maybe move on to flowers, should we?
Yeah, okay.
Plants, sorry, not flowers. Oh, but filling it. We have had quite a lot of questions about how to fill the pond, so maybe this bit would be really useful. Can you see that? John?
I'm still looking at liners here.
Oh God, not this again.
No,
Could you just talk about, do you need the slides, do you think?
not really.
Yeah, let's just try it without.
All right. Okay, so what I was going to say about plants is that once you've got your pond dug and lined and filled with water, and you said people were asking about filling. The only thing really to say about filling is that if you fill with tap water has quite a lot of nitrates in it. And remember what I said, one of the things you're trying to do is to reduce the amount of nitrates in the pond. That's one of the key things. So filling with tap water is not the best option if you can avoid it. If you have water butts and things and you've got enough water in them to fill your pond, then use that in preference. But often you don't have, and so you have no option but to fill with tap water. If that's the case, it doesn't really matter. You will get an algal bloom, but you will likely get an algal bloom in the early days or the early stages of succession anyway. So you'll just get a slightly bigger one if you use tap water than if you use some sort of a softer water from the rain, from collecting rainwater. So don't worry too much about filling with tap water. It's not a big problem. But what you can do is you won't be able to avoid all of those early stages of succession. You won't be able to avoid the big algal blooms, but you will be able to accelerate the process of maturing the pond by some strategic planting. Initially, what I would do is to plant the emergent plants. Now, I did send you, Steph, handout. Perhaps you
I've
could.
got that, and I'm going to send that on after this to everyone.
So
I'll
you'll
get
get
the-
some information on the types of plants that might be useful in a handout from Steph afterwards. But the key thing to do early on is to plant emergent plants. The plants that live in the shallows, that their roots are in the water, but the plant is growing above the water level. I differentiate them from the submerged plants, which are generally referred to as oxygenators. So plant the emergents, plant as many as you can early on, because they're going to be your first line of attack against the algal blooms that are going to characterize the early stages of the pond, because they're the first ones that are going to start competing with the algae for the available nutrients in the pond. And as many as you can plant, the better. It doesn't matter what they are. A purist would say go with native plants, but it's not necessarily the case that you need to go with native plants. It depends entirely on what you want. From the wildlife point of view, they don't care whether the plants are native or not. There are some plants that are invasive non-natives. Again, it's on the handout what they are. Just be aware of what they are. I don't think you're going to really be able to buy them anymore, because I think there's about 5 species that have been banned from being sold in garden centres and whatnot because they are invasive. But you may still get them if you share plants with other people, or if other people give you plants from their pond. So just be aware of what they are and how to recognise them. And that way you'll avoid putting them into your own pond if you're getting given plants by people who have already got established ponds. Irises are great as sort of emergents. Things like king cups, those sort of things, get them in early, and they'll help you to reduce the amount of time that you're going to have in the early stages of succession. I say that to go with the emergents first, because if you go with the oxygenators, the little submerged plants, they're likely to get swamped by algal blooms early on. So get the process of competing for the nitrates started, and then plant oxygenators, and they're going to have a better chance of surviving. And you'll find that within a relatively short time, you should start to reach some sort of an equilibrium where plants are thriving better than the algae. But you will have algal blooms. Everybody gets terribly frustrated, and often within just a few months of building a pond, they're saying, why did I do this? It's too much frustration, because they're getting lots of algae, blanket weed, and everything's getting sort of swamped by it and overrun with it. From the wildlife point of view, it doesn't matter. It's only from people's point of view. People don't like these algae, but the wildlife don't mind at all. So be relaxed about these algal blooms. They do end. You do get to a stage where the pond's established and the algae disappears, or it doesn't disappear altogether, but it becomes manageable. So that's the key thing about plants in the early stages here. My preference would be to go with natives, but like I say, it really doesn't matter. The wildlife don't mind. Shall I take questions? Because then I can focus what I'm saying on what people want to hear.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And if you've got to go, then thank you for coming, and you can watch the recording when you've got more time. You can skip to the questions bit if you need to go, but otherwise stick around and we'll answer some questions. If people could just ask on video or with their voices, that would be good to save time, actually. Anyone brave enough?
What are the best plants for newts, John?
The best plants for newts? Well, like I said before, the ones that are the right shape for them to fold, they quite like ones that have long, thin leaves. So grass type, that sort of shape of a blade of grass. What you'll find is what a newt will do is they'll lay the egg on the end of a blade of grass. So something like floating sweetgrass, which is Glyceria fluitans, is a popular one. They'll lay an egg on the end of the blade of grass, fold the grass over and stick it down, and then they'll lay another egg a bit further down the blade and fold it again. And what you find is a blade of grass will get sort of concertinaed up into a very short little stumpy thing, all concertinaed, full of eggs. So those sort of shapes suit them. So floating sweetgrasses are good. some of the oxygenators, there's something called curled leaf pondweed, which is very popular. It belongs to a genus called Potamogeton. Starwort is another popular one. They like that. That seems to be one they'll lay their eggs on fairly readily. But anything that's got that right sort of shape and anything that's flexible enough for them to use their back legs to manipulate it and fold it over. So things like lilies are completely useless. They can't manipulate those at all. So small, delicate plants, really, but with long, thin leaves. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
What would you say are the best emergent ones and the best oxygenating plants?
What would I say are the best? It doesn't matter. I think the question should be turned on its head and asked, what should you avoid, really? And in the case of emergent plants, the ones I would be inclined to avoid would be things like reed mace and bulrush and reeds, simply because they get extremely big and they create these massive, great big sort of rhizome mats in the bottom of the pond, which very quickly build up so thick that you lose a lot of the pond depth, you lose a lot of the open water. And in a small pond, these things, they're what you might consider deep water emergents. So they'll grow not just around the edges, they'll be able to grow in the middle of most average garden ponds. And so they'll just sort of take it over. But things like flag irises and stuff like that. There's another Lyceria, it's called reed. Oh, I can't remember the common name of it now. But one of the Glyceria, one of the grasses, there's a reed sweetgrass, it's called. It's quite a nice little plant. And then there's all sorts of things like aquatic mints and water plantains, for example. There's a range of things, but you just want to avoid the really large ones, the ones that grow in lakes, basically, because they will take over a pond. So reed mace is the key one. If you can avoid that, that's a good idea. As for the submerged plants, the oxygenators, they're all pretty good. Somebody's already asked about which ones the newts are particularly fond of, and I've kind of explained that. But some of the other ones that are pretty, if you like, and nice to see in a pond are things like crowfoot, which grows up from the bottom, and when it reaches the surface, it flowers on the surface with a whole sort of raft of little tiny white flowers in the summer. So water crowfoot is a really quite attractive plant. There's something called frogbit that I'm particularly fond of. It's like a very, very small lily, and it grows in the bottom, and then it releases itself from the bottom and floats up and becomes a floating plant. And it's very small, little sort of lily-shaped leaves and a little white flower on each one. They're quite pretty. So there's a whole mass of different stuff. And from the wildlife perspective, they're not that worried what you have. If you want quick growing stuff, hornwort's a good oxygenator to put in. There's the list goes on. And I think when you get the handout that I've given to Steph, you'll probably get some of those questions answered anyway. Does that help?
Thank you. Yep.
Wow, thanks, John. You're getting lots of thanks and nice comments in the chat about how knowledgeable you are. But yeah.
Well, I'm sorry the technology didn't quite behave as it should, really, did it?
I know, it's so
But
bloody
never mind.
powerful. Yeah, I'll have to try and figure that out for next time, everyone. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And I'm on holiday next week, so Lucy, my colleague's going to be hosting the next one, but I'll see you the week after. So yeah, have fun thinking about your pond and where you're going to put it.
Thank you very much. Bye all.
Thanks, John. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Steffi.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh dear. Someone's asked if the other questions in the chat can be answered.
Oh, there's some there.